Hi, I'm Scott Mansell and welcome to Driver 61's University Series. In today's tutorial we're going to take a very general look at data logging, why it's used so commonly now in motorsport, the basics of data logging and how exactly it can make you quicker on track. Now this video is the first of a series of data logging tutorials where I'm going to go through in depth how to get the most out of data logging. If you haven't already seen the first tutorials in the Drivers University, please go back to driver61.com/uni and take a look at the first tutorials which focus on fundamental driving technique, including vision, weight transfer and techniques like how to trail brake. Now there are many data logging systems available on the market at the moment and it can be quite confusing to understand what you might need, and that's something again that I'm going to go through in a later tutorial. You can get systems that are purely based on GPS that will just track your speed and maybe some G-force information. Then you can get systems that also record your video, up to the high-end data logging systems which will include chassis information such as ride height, tyre temperatures and suspension position. So data logging systems can record a vast range of information both for drivers and engineers, but I'm going to focus these tutorials on the channels that we use as drivers and race coaches to help make you quicker on the circuit. There are many different channels that we can find useful as drivers and driver coaches, but the main channels that you would look at when you're analysing your data with a coach or by yourself will be the speed, the throttle trace, the brake pressure, the steering inputs and the G-force. And all of these pieces of information give you different insights to your technique and how you may need to change it to be quicker on the circuit. Now, aside from using pure data traces, some data logging systems such as the vBox system, which I'm going to use an example in a little while, have synchronized video footage. So it's possible to have your footage and your coach's footage next to each other and go through frame by frame, so you can really analyze the position of the car on track and see if there's any big errors in your racing lines. Many data logging systems now also have a live time delta on the dashboard of your car. This is something that I find very useful when I'm driving any type of car, no matter if I've got experience in the car or not. The time delta will actually take the best lap that is in the car that you've done or that your coach has done, and it will update every 1/10 of a second or so to show you how your current lap is comparing to the benchmark lap as you go around the circuit. So it's really useful for accelerating the learning process when you're on the circuit, because you can try a different braking point, you can try a slightly different line through a corner, and you can get instant feedback from seeing whether the delta is increasing or decreasing as to whether that specific thing that you've changed is actually quicker. So how do you use data logging to improve your lap time? Well, as I previously mentioned, I'm going to go through each step in a lot more detail in future tutorials, but in this one I'm just going to give a general overview. The first thing that you need is that you'll need to have a benchmark or comparable lap. So yes, you can use your own lap between sessions or even in the same session to see how things might have changed, whether it be your braking point or your racing line, to see if a different racing line or a different braking point, for example, has improved your time or your exit speed. However, most non-professional racing drivers will go around the circuit and lap in a relatively consistent way, meaning that they won't generally try different things. And so this technique in comparing your own lap to another of your own lap is quite difficult, because you may have got into a rhythm and you may not be trying different things. So if you're going to compare your lap against somebody else's, it's much better to have a coach there or a professional driver to compare your lap against theirs and see where the differences are, to see where you can change your driving style or where you may be a little bit early on the brakes, for example, to improve your lap time. Now, obviously, it's best if the 2 laps are done on the same day, preferably in the same session. As I've mentioned many times in these tutorials, the circuit conditions and the amount of grip that the circuit gives you will change week by week, day by day, and even within the day itself. So it's best if you get your benchmark lap in a car that has the same conditions, the same tyre wear, the same track temperature, for example, to give the best and most fair comparison. So without further ado, let's jump into some actual data so I can give you a general overview of how the data looks and how I might initially begin to analyze the data to make myself or my client quicker on the circuit. Now, we're using some data from the Silverstone Grand Prix circuit in a classic Jaguar E-Type car, and we'll be using the Circuit Tools 2 software by Race Logic. So here we are in the default screen for the Circuit Tools 2 software, and as you can see, at first glance it might look a little bit complicated because there is a lot going on here, but it's actually very simple and very well thought out and laid out once you get used to it. So in the top left hand box here you can see two sessions. We've got vBox 0001 and vBox 0003 with a list of all the laps here. So you can click on the laps and an extra video will come up and then go away if you click off it again. And as you can see around the video here, we've got a blue square and a red square. Well, that relates to the data trace line just here and the colors just here. So we've got the red line here and the blue box just here. And this is a summary of all your laps for each session. So you can see here that this driver was quickest on lap 4 with a 2-minute 25.58 around the Silverstone Grand Prix circuit. If we just pull the slider across here, you can see that the data logging has automatically added sectors into the software, and it does that using the braking point for each corners, and it goes just a little bit before the braking point, so that you've got equal sectors from just before the braking point, on the brakes, through the corner, through the middle of the corner, accelerating up to just before the next corner before you get on the brakes, and it keeps that as a section. So if you want to take a look at the track map here, you can click on the little flag in the top left hand of the screen here, and you can see the sectors as we go around the circuit. So all nicely done, all automatic, which is actually incredible because it makes it very easy to compare sector times here. And you can see that the driver actually lost on this lap, he lost 9/10 of a second here in sector 3. So obviously there's something wrong there with his technique, or possibly a little bit of traffic on this particular lap. So on the left hand side of the screen here, we've got a full list of all the channels that we have available to us. So all you do here is you can just click on the channel. So for example, longitudinal acceleration, which is longitudinal G, so you can see where you're getting on the brakes, on the accelerator. You just check the box and obviously it just clicks and pops up down here at the bottom of the screen. But for coaching a driver, I'll generally only use 4 or 5 different channels if we've got access to them. I'll use the speed, as I mentioned, the throttle trace, the brake trace if it's available, the time delta, which you can see just down here, and the RPM, so we can make sure that the driver's in the correct gear at all times on the circuit. Then obviously in the top of the shot here, we've got the 2 videos. As I mentioned, the blue square around the outside of this video denotes the blue line on the data, and the red one denotes the red line on the data. So into the data, the most important part of the logging, in my opinion. Up here you can see the speed trace. As you can see, it's coming, accelerating along the straight, on the brakes, into turn 1 at Silverstone, and then back on the throttle, a little lift as we're coming into turn 2, and then a big braking zone into the tight right of turn 3. We've got the TPS, the throttle position, the throttle trace here. So this is a really important one for seeing how smooth the driver is and to see what their technique is like when they're getting back on the accelerator. The third data trace that we have here is the brake data trace, and if I click and zoom in just a little bit more, you can see that we've zoomed into the data here. Gives you a bit of a more clear view. The brake trace, in terms of coaching quite an advanced driver, is critically important. As you'll have seen if you've watched any of my other tutorials, we really focus on the brake pressure and how you trail off the brakes and control the weight transfer and the platform of the car, which is what you really need to do if you want to be quick on track. On the fourth row, we have the time delta, which shows the gain or the loss against the quickest lap in this vBox data system. Now, the quickest lap in this software always goes to the red line. It automatically does that, which makes it very easy to know who's the quickest, and it just gets into a rhythm, so it's really easy to understand when you're looking at this data. So you can see here that the time delta is changing throughout the lap, and that's something that you'll generally see as you go through. Bear in mind that the range here is only 1.2 seconds, so actually sometimes it can really look like this, but if the range is only 0.3 of a second, the differences in braking points, in turning, can just be a difference in style. Some drivers might go into the corner a little bit quicker, have a slower minimum corner speed and then accelerate out a little bit earlier, whereas some drivers may try and carry more speed, more minimum corner speed through the corner. And it's just a difference in technique, but in the data you can see it as quite a big difference in the time delta. And finally, on the bottom row, we have the RPM, and doesn't look massively important in this data that I'm looking at the moment, because it looks like both drivers are changing gear and using all the RPM available to themselves. So these two laps are actually quite close together. The difference, the delta here, as you can see, is only 0.35 of a second over the whole 2 minutes and 25 seconds, which is obviously very, very close together. These two drivers are obviously quite well matched. So when looking at this data, the first thing that I would do is to switch to the video view and watch the two videos side by side together. Watch the complete lap, because when you watch it at full speed, you can see the flow of the car, you can see the technique of the driver, rather than just going through step by step. So once I've watched a full lap of these drivers side by side, or the driver that I'm coaching, once I've watched their lap, if there's no big issues with their racing line or things that I can see visually through the camera here, obviously we can see the driver's steering input into the car. If there's no big issues there, then I would dive deeper and really go in detail with the data. So let me head over to the screen that I would use for the data now. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the full screen of data, and again, it's the same setup that I showed you before. We've got the speed trace, the throttle trace, the brake trace, the RPM, and finally the delta at the bottom. It's a little bit difficult to read in this situation as it is now, and you'd want to go into a little bit more detail, but the first thing to do would be to take a look at the entire lap, to compare the differences in the speed trace to the differences in the delta, and see if there's any big areas, and probably focus on those. Obviously it depends in the situation that I would have with my client. If I already know their driving technique quite well, and if we're already a few sessions through the test day, then I already know what they're doing, I already know where they need to find the time. Whereas if it's a new client of mine, or at the beginning of the test day, I would go through corner by corner and see if they're making any mistakes there. So the next thing to do is, once we've looked at the whole lap and where a driver may be losing some time. So as you can see, there's some big losses and big gains here. There's a big step here, which is minimum corner speed in the loop onto the back straight. Then this driver continues to gain some time down the back straight, so the left onto the Wellington straight at Silverstone is obviously carrying a bit more speed through there. Then continuing to gain down the Wellington straight, slightly better on the brakes, but then this driver is better through Copse and through Maggots, Beckett's and Chapel. You can see this is Copse just here, and this is Maggots, Beckett's and Chapel onto the Hanger straight just here. So you can see there's some wins, there's some gains. I've taken an overview of the lap. I can see that there's slight differences in technique, some areas where one driver might have a bit more confidence than another. But the first thing that I've seen, and the biggest area where we have this big time drop here on the delta, seems to be a mistake from one of the drivers. So let's go into that in more detail so I can quickly explain and give a real life example as to how we would use the data logging to analyze an issue. So let me just zoom into this area here. Now this is COPS, I can tell you from just looking at the shape of the data here. So we've got the speed at the top. Now the red driver, the quicker driver here, you can see that they're decelerating into the corner. So I'm going to get rid of the RPM because we don't exactly need it at this point, and I want to zoom in a little bit more into the speed trace really. So we're coming up to COPS here. Let's just head back over to the video so we can see what it looks like. You can see we're just here coming into COPS. Both drivers are getting on the brake. If we look at the brake trace just here, both drivers are getting on the brake at almost exactly the same point. There's a slight difference in technique here where the red driver is peaking a little bit more and then having to get out the brake. Now the reason that he's doing that, I suspect, is that he's got on the brakes a little bit too hard. You can see that he's just peaked in this area here a little bit earlier than the blue driver, and he's locked a tyre, so he's had to get back out the brakes and then get back on them again once the wheels start rotating again. And you can see at this point, if we look at the speed trace here, the red line, the red driver tries to carry more speed into the apex than the blue driver. So, and it corresponds with what the data is telling us here from the brake trace. You can see the driver's got on the brakes a little bit harder than the blue driver, had to get out of them because he's probably had a lockup, got back on them, so we're right on the threshold of the braking here, and then he's tried to get out the brakes as soon as possible to carry as much speed into the corner as possible. Now in this classic Jag, it's likely that you'll have to get out the brakes quite early so the platform of the car settles as early as possible, and then we can get the car into the corner before we get back on the accelerator. Now if you don't understand, or if you haven't seen the tutorial on weight transfer and how we manage or how we should manage the car on the corner entry with how we come off the brakes, watch the Drivers University tutorial on weight transfer and trail braking. So this driver's come in towards the apex of COPS quicker than the blue line, and we can see here, if we take a look at the speed, that the blue driver at this point is at 82 miles an hour and the red driver is at 88 miles an hour, so that's a huge difference as we're coming into the corner. If we head back over to the video really quickly, we can see that the red driver here, who is the driver who's coming into the apex too quickly, has 88 miles an hour and the other driver has 82. They're back on the accelerator, the other driver, so they're trying to settle the rear of the car. And you can just see from the video here that the driver on the right, the red driver, has got lots of steering angle in the car. So he's coming too quick, the car's understeering now, and if we head back to the data, and I haven't actually watched any of this, so this is me just understanding what's going on with the data, and just from this you can see what's actually happening with the platform of the car, and I can tell you that the car's understeering, because this is generally how the data looks when a driver heads into the corner too quickly, the red line here, and you can see that he's tried to get back on the throttle here at this point. He's got back on the throttle just a little bit, but he's already got lots of understeer, tried to get back on the throttle, and then realise that he's not going to make it around the corner because he's got loads of understeer and he's gone in probably 5 or 6 miles an hour too quick compared to the other driver, and he's had to get back out the accelerator, let the car turn a little bit more before he gets back on. And this is a really common example of when a driver might not be looking far enough ahead because he's looking down here, he doesn't realise how quickly he's going into the corner, and then he's making all of his reactions or his inputs too late to rectify the problem. Whereas the blue driver here, you can see he's slowed the car down a little bit more than the red driver, 5 or 6 miles an hour, as I mentioned. He's got the minimum speed earlier in the corner, probably exactly in the right position, and then he's got on the throttle quite hard, I must say, but he's got back on the throttle nice and early, and he's carried that speed down the next section of track towards Maggots, Beckett's and Chapel. So let's just confirm what I'm seeing here in the data, see if that's true in the video as well, just to double up belt and braces and make sure that's exactly what we're seeing. So yeah, we're on the apex here at Copse. You can see from the video here that the red driver, the driver that's carried too much speed into the corner, has still got lots and lots of understeer. He's got too much steering angle for this point in the corner, whereas the driver on the left, steering wheel actually looks straight, which means that he's probably just got the car just rotated slightly. It's sat there with a nice tiny bit of rotation and he's back on the accelerator. So you can see here from the green trace here, this is a visual representation for the video of the throttle trace. You can see he's back on the throttle at this point, whereas this driver is about to get back out of the accelerator. You can see here that it's just having to get back out of it because he's pushing wide. Look at the position of the car here. The car's pushed out too much, whereas this driver, a lot more straight lines in the corner, which is generally what you would have to do in a classic car. They've not got much grip and they've got relatively high amount of power. So in that type of car, you have to slow it down, get the thing turned, like I say, a lot more straight lines. So get it slowed down, get it turned, have quite a slow minimum corner speed before you turn the car and get back on the accelerator to propel the car down the next straight. Whereas the driver on the right tried to carry too much speed through the corner and is running out wide. He's not realised it quite early enough, had to get back out the throttle, which has massive consequences as he goes down the next straight. So in this little section here, if we take a look at the time loss from this mistake by that driver, and we compare the delta at this point, the blue driver's almost a tenth of a second up, but by the time we get to the next area when we get on the brakes, he's actually almost 4/10 of a second up. So going into the corner too quickly, making that mistake, has cost the red driver 3/10 of a second. So what would be my advice in this situation? Well, the first thing, I'd try to diagnose the reason that the driver made the mistake. And the reason that he made that mistake, I think, is because he's not looking far enough ahead. He went in too quick, but then he continued to make the problem even bigger by getting back on the accelerator. And that, to me, when a driver goes in too quick, makes the first mistake, but then continues to try to ride it out and thinks that he'll get around the corner, gets back on the throttle, then lifts, finally realizes that he's not going to make it around the corner and has to lift. That all stems from vision problems and not looking far enough ahead through the corner. Now granted, at Copse it is very difficult to look all the way through the corner because you do have the barrier on the inside, so it might be a slight rhythm problem as well. So my advice to this driver would be that he's braking in the right point. He's made that first mistake where he's got on the brakes and locked up and had to come back out them a little bit, but then he just tried to get off the brakes too soon. So it's a case of a little bit more repetition, probably teaching himself to look that little bit further ahead of himself, and if he feels like he's going in too quick, just be a bit more patient, let the car slow down, and maybe then you'll only lose 1/10 of a second and not 4/10 as he lost here. So that's just a very quick example of what we can do with data logging. I've looked at a mistake here, but we can use data logging, and more often than not, we're using data logging to see where you can improve rather than identify mistakes. And I like to really use it to, in a general sense, in a detail corner by corner, but also in a general sense to see how a driver performs over a session or over a race distance, and focus on minimizing mistakes and finding those areas where the driver can perform better and easily make big wins. So with this data, there's so many details and there's so many things to think about that it's easy to get lost and try to focus on too many different things when you're out on the circuit. And as you know, and as I've mentioned in all of these tutorials, there's a lot going on when you're out on the track, and we're almost at the top of our capacity. So it's quite difficult to hold on to any information when you're out in the car. So what I like to try and do is to look at the data to try and identify the overriding themes, the overriding issues, not just to say, oh, you need to go 3 miles an hour quicker into turn 2. That can be helpful when the driver's 1/2 tenth off the pace. However, generally drivers can be a little bit further off the pace than that, and they need to learn the general themes of driving. So I like to give a driver 2 maximum 3 things to focus on in their next session. So I would take a look in detail, summarize what they need to do, and give them the fundamental techniques that they need to try and improve. So probably for this driver, and I haven't looked at all the data, but probably for this driver, it would be to try and look that little bit further ahead. And the second thing would be to think about the platform of the car and how he's braking into the corner to distribute the grip evenly. As you saw in here, he got off the brakes too early, which means the front of the car pops up, which gives the front less grip and the rear more grip. And then he got the understeer going into cops. If he'd have kept the brakes on just a little bit more, he could have kept the nose down, removed the understeer, taken a little bit more speed out of the car, and then he would have been able to get on the throttle properly and propel himself down the next straight. And as I mentioned, if you haven't seen any of the previous tutorials on weight transfer, grip, driving at the limit, please watch those so you can understand what I'm talking about through this next series of data logging videos. So thank you very much for watching. I know that was a very general video in data logging, and I am going to go over in much more detail the specifics of how we can use it to make yourself quicker on circuit as efficiently as possible, because that's what we're all about. So that's all for this tutorial. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the Driver 61 channel, and if you're a racing driver, please support us by checking out our Motorsport store at driver61.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.